All right, well, welcome back to this final part in our series, How Do I Know It's God? As we now explore the 12th, 13th, and 14th rule in St. Ignatius of Loyola's Rules for Discernment. Here, Ignatius shifts, and he gives us three metaphors which highlight three particular aspects of the enemy and the way that he works, that he wishes us to recognize and thus to be able to counter, so that we can overcome all of the enemy's temptations. Not just spiritual desolation specifically, but all of his temptations in general. So each of these three rules will give us a metaphor that describes something about the enemy and at least implies an action that we should take. So with that, let's dive in to his rules. In the 12th rule, Ignatius uses a metaphor that is rather problematic these days. So let's read the metaphor first, and then let's unpack what's going on there and what aspect of the enemy it is that Ignatius wants us to learn as we look at this particular rule. So here's Rule 12. The 12th. The enemy acts like a woman in being weak when faced with strength and strong when faced with weakness. 4. As it is proper to a woman, when she is fighting with some man, to lose heart and to flee when the man confronts her firmly, and on the contrary, if the man begins to flee, losing heart, the anger, vengeance, and ferocity of the woman grow, and know no bounds. In the same way, it is proper to the enemy to weaken and lose heart, fleeing and ceasing his temptations, when the person who is exercising himself resists the temptations of the enemy firmly, doing what is diametrically opposed to them. And, on the contrary, if the person who is exercising himself begins to be afraid and to lose heart in suffering the temptations, there is no beast so fierce on the face of the earth as the enemy of human nature in following out his damnable intention with such growing malice. So here we have a metaphor that is designed to highlight the essential weakness of the enemy of human nature, the enemy of our salvation. Many people approach this metaphor in different ways. Given that it's not really an appealing metaphor to most people today. The enemy acts like a woman, and being weak when faced with strength and strong when faced with weakness. It's important to remember in this metaphor that Ignatius is describing a woman in a fight with a man. This is not a natural state. This is not how God intended man and woman to act. And so the enemy of human nature seeks to do things that are, well, unnatural. Nonetheless, if we find the metaphor troubling, we could consider a similar metaphor. Father Gallagher suggests that perhaps we think of it more like a spoiled child. A spoiled child begins to throw a tantrum, and because the parents allow this to happen, the child has some confidence that he'll be able to succeed in throwing this tantrum and get what he wants. And the longer that the tantrum goes on, the harder it is to control and to bring under its proper guidance and so on. Whereas when a child starts to throw a tantrum, they send a sidelong glance at their parents, and if they recognize the storm clouds beginning to gather, they will quickly weaken and lose heart and give up their tantrum. That's how we keep a child from being spoiled. Whatever way we approach the metaphor, what Ignatius really wants us to grasp in Rule 12 is the essential weakness of the enemy. When he is met with weakness, when the person exercising himself spiritually becomes afraid and begins to lose heart in suffering the temptation, whether it's spiritual desolation or any other form of temptation, the enemy grows in his strength. There is no beast, St. Ignatius says, on the whole face of the earth, as fierce as the enemy of human nature in carrying about his damnable intention with such growing malice. The longer we let temptation go, the more it will grow in its strength and the harder it will be to resist. But here's the good news. When met with strength, when the person exercising himself in spiritual things remains firm, resists the temptations of the enemy at their very beginning, and does what is diametrically opposed to them. The temptation is to shorten my time of prayer. I stay the time and I even extend it a little. The temptation is to engage in an angry, pert remark to this person, return their little verbal jab with one of my own. Instead, I exercise patience. I restrain my anger. I act with charity. As soon as that movement comes. But the longer that I allow those impulses to grow, the more that they're going to gain strength. But here's the really good news. St. Ignatius says that when we meet temptation firmly at the beginning, the enemy weakens and loses heart, fleeing and ceasing his temptation. That's really good news. As St. Ignatius has told us in previous rules, we always have sufficient grace to attain eternal salvation. The help of God's grace is always ready to hand. It's grace that is sufficient to resist all our enemies. And when we take hold of that grace, as soon as we recognize temptation, the enemy will weaken, lose heart, and flee. That's really good news. So when we recognize the essential weakness of the enemy, temptation is not something to be feared. It is an opportunity for us to grow in virtue, to resist precisely by resisting, to choose to love God and thus to turn away from all that would lead me away from God and to freely reject that. That is one of the purposes for which God allows or permits temptation. So what Ignatius wants to see in Rule 12 is that once we recognize temptation, we've become aware and we've understood it for what it is, we should reject it immediately. And when we do so, the essential weakness of the enemy will be exposed. He will lose heart and he will flee. That's really good news. So that's the first characteristic of the enemy that St. Ignatius wants us to become aware of and to then apply in our spiritual life. When temptation comes, we resist it as soon as we recognize it, and it will be less likely to ensnare us. Now, in the 13th rule, St. Ignatius highlights another aspect of the enemy. And this is how the enemy likes to work in darkness. The 13th, likewise, he conducts himself as a false lover, in wishing to remain secret and not be revealed. For a dissolute man, who speaking with evil intention makes dishonorable advances to a daughter of a good father or to a wife of a good husband, wishes his words and persuasions to be secret, and the contrary displeases him very much, when the daughter reveals to her father or the wife to her husband his false words and depraved intention, because he easily perceives that he will not be able to succeed with the undertaking begun. In the same way, when the enemy of human nature brings his wiles and persuasions to the just soul, he wishes and desires that they be received and kept in secret. For when one reveals them to one's good confessor or to another spiritual person who knows his deceits and malicious designs, it weighs on him very much, because he perceives that he will not be able to succeed with the malicious undertaking he has begun, since his manifest deceits have been revealed. Here St. Ignatius highlights that the enemy likes to work in secret. He likes to work in darkness because it's easier to confuse us when we're alone and when we're in the dark. So he uses here the metaphor of a dissolute man trying to seduce the daughter of a good father or the wife of a good husband. He wants all of his wiles and persuasions to be kept in secret, because he knows that as soon as the daughter reveals them to her father or the wife to her husband, the jig is up. He's not going to succeed in seducing this woman. Something similar happens with the enemy of human nature. He wants all of his wiles and persuasions to be kept in secret. Keep it in the dark. Don't tell anyone about this. No one will understand. They will laugh at you. They think that you're a horrible person. You ever heard those kind of thoughts? I know I have. That's the enemy whispering in us, insinuating. Especially in times of spiritual desolation, those thoughts seem very convincing. But instead, when we break the silence, when we bring it out into the light and speak to the two people that Ignatius names, one is one's good confessor, so in the sacrament of penance, revealing the ways that we have been tempted, or to another spiritual person who knows the enemy's deceits. That's the key quality. What makes a good confessor, what makes another appropriate spiritual person, is someone who knows the enemy's deceits. Often I don't recognize my own experience because my nose is just too close to it. I'm looking at a mosaic and I can't tell if this little blue tile, because my nose is right up next to it, if that little blue tile is part of the Blessed Virgin Mary's veil or the donkey's ear. But someone who's not that close, who's not in the experience, can often see more clearly and recognize there's something fishy about all of this, and can highlight what the enemy might be doing. I've had this experience many times in my own life when I have my monthly conversation with my own spiritual director. Speaking about what's happening and what's unfolding, often he will highlight ways that perhaps there's been some spiritual desolation that I haven't really resisted. Or there was just a way of thinking that had crept in. I didn't really realize how much it was causing me anxiety or agitation or undercutting my energy or my confidence or my hope or any number of other things. And recognize what else St. Ignatius says in this rule. When we do this, when we speak to another person who knows the deceits and tactics of the enemy, an appropriate spiritual person, this weighs very much on our enemy, because he knows that his designs will be revealed for the manifest deceits that they are, and thus will not succeed. We see a similar thing to what we saw in Rule 12, a word of hope, by highlighting this tactic that the enemy wants us to keep everything in secret and in the dark. St. Ignatius first of all points us to bring it to the appropriate spiritual person who knows the tactics and deceits of the enemy. Bring it to the light, speak about it. And the good news, the enemy will be weighed down by this. He will again lose heart. He doesn't want this to happen. That's part of the reason why we sometimes have that sense that I really can't talk to anybody about this. No one will understand. Many of the saints experienced this in their lives. St. Therese of Lisieux writes about the experience that she had the night before her solemn profession. She was going to make her final vows as a Carmelite nun. There was a time of retreat when the members who would be making their vows, the members of the community, would be separated from the rest of the sisters in that time of retreat. It's on the final night. Their solemn profession is to take place the next day. St. Therese writes that such a storm arose in her soul, the likes of which she'd never seen before. She was dark, she was confused. The only thing that came clear out of this experience was that she was not called to be a Carmelite, and that she was deluding herself and all of her superiors and persisting in pursuing that vocation. This is St. Therese, who, from the age of 5, knew she was called to be a Carmelite. If anyone has had a vocation in the church, it's St. Therese of Lisieux. But here, in a very deep and very dark and intense experience of spiritual desolation, she becomes convinced that she doesn't have a vocation. She needs to leave the Carmel and go back to the world. She's come to this decision, and what she does is she goes and she calls the novice mistress, which would have been her immediate superior within the religious community, calls her out of choir. You have to understand how it works in a religious community. Out of choir means that they were gathered for one of their times of community prayer. Everyone in the community would have known that St. Therese is supposed to be on retreat, secluded from the rest of the community. And here she is, walking into the choir, pulling the novice mistress out and asking to speak with her. Sometimes it can be very difficult to break the silence and to bring things to the light. The choice does not always arise spontaneously. The voices that tell us we can't do this, we'll be embarrassed, no one will understand, and so on, can be very convincing. But St. Therese does this, and the novice mistress dismisses all of her fears and sets her at ease. And even though St. Therese was completely at ease and the darkness had lifted and the storm had passed, she still wanted to go even further. This is where St. Ignatius really does encourage us not only to resist and reject the enemy, but even to overthrow him. St. Therese wants to go and speak with the Mother Superior, the superior of the entire religious community there at Lisieux, which she eventually does. And she writes in the Story of a Soul that once she told Mother Superior about this, Mother Superior simply laughed and encouraged St. Therese that she should just simply make her solemn profession and give no heed to this. But St. Therese knew that she wanted to do this, not simply to resist the enemy, but to overthrow him. Because he is essentially weak. And when we bring things to the light, he might be able to confuse me when I'm by myself. But when I'm journeying together with another person who's not in the immediate experience that I'm having, the manifest deceits of the enemy are made known, and they can be overthrown with the power of God's grace. So the enemy wants us to keep things secret. Thus, we should act by bringing them to light, knowing that when we do so, we speak about them with an appropriate spiritual person who knows the tactics and deceits of the enemy. This weighs on him very much. So Ignatius, again, in this metaphor, highlighting now the desire of the enemy to work in secret, to work in darkness, gives us great encouragement for overthrowing the ways that the enemy tries to isolate us and not allow us to journey together. We do need to be careful about who we speak to. It should be someone who is familiar with these rules for discernment, who has perhaps more experience than we do. Someone we trust, someone we feel comfortable opening up what might seem like very deep, dark, and vulnerable places within us. So we shouldn't just tell this to anybody we happen to meet on the street. That's not the way to break the silence and not what St. Ignatius is encouraging here. It's rather someone that is familiar with the tactics and deceits of the enemy, familiar with the art of discerning spirits, so that they can help us be aware and understand what's happening so we can take the appropriate action. So that's Rule 13. So we've seen that the enemy is essentially weak, and thus should be resisted as soon as we recognize his tactics. Rule 12, he wants to keep things in the darkness and secret, and thus to isolate us from any help that might clarify things. Rule 13. And in Rule 14, he highlights another aspect of the enemy. This is, as one friend of mine puts it, Satan is a jerk. He attacks us where we're weak. So let's take a look here at Rule 14, the final rule in this set. He continues to describe how the enemy of human nature acts. The 14th. Likewise, he acts like a leader intent upon conquering and robbing what he desires. For, just as a captain and leader of an army in the field, pitching his camp and exploring the fortifications and defenses of a stronghold, attacks it at the weakest point, in the same way, The enemy of human nature, roving about, looks in turn at all our theological, cardinal, and moral virtues, and where he finds us weakest and most in need of our eternal salvation, there he attacks and attempts to take us. Here in this metaphor, St. Ignatius draws on his experience as a soldier. He's not speaking here of a soldier and a leader of an army fighting in a noble cause. He's speaking here of a leader who is intent on conquering and robbing what he desires. This is someone who is out to pillage, leading a band of brigands. Coming on a fortified city, he takes his brigands and has a little scouting party. They go around the walls of the city, staying safely out of bow and cannon shot, but close enough that they can examine carefully the defenses, and then make a circuit of the city, and they see where are the defenses weakest. And it is there that they make their attack and attempt to take the city. So, similarly, the enemy of human nature roves about and looks at all of our theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, all of our cardinal virtues, prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude, and all of our moral virtues. So the sub-virtues that flow from the cardinal virtues of prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude. Things like patience, humility, charity, generosity, kindness, forbearance, and so on. Where he finds us weakest and most in need for our eternal salvation, there he attacks and attempts to take us. So much like that leader of the band of brigands looking for the weakness in the defense, the enemy, Satan, looks for where we are weak, and there he attacks us. Because he's a jerk. And that's what jerks do. They pick on the weak. We may have noticed that if we pay attention, certain kinds of temptations often come at us in certain situations. I may notice a pattern where this certain situation or this certain person tries my patience. I become frustrated. I start to become short. We may notice that a certain type of temptation comes when I'm feeling a certain mood. Maybe I'm feeling stressed, or I'm feeling kind of bored, or I'm feeling sad. If we begin to recognize that pattern, then we can begin to strengthen that. We can begin to look at other ways of approaching that. We can take counsel with an appropriate spiritual person. How might I deal with this? What are some tactics that I might put in place? We can bring it to prayer and see what light the Holy Spirit wants to shed on it in giving us some light. We can also look at where we have our psychological vulnerabilities. Maybe I just need to learn how to deal with stress. This is where psychological counseling can actually be very helpful. Maybe it's my insecurities, my struggle to really learn how to accept myself, any number of other things like that. And psychological counseling, as well as spiritual counseling, can both be helpful and can work together in strengthening that weak point so that I'm less likely to be attacked there and less likely to fall when I am. We've been speaking a lot about spiritual desolation and how it comes. We've also spoken about how spiritual desolation is often connected with non-spiritual desolation. We may be more prone to experience spiritual desolation when we are physically tired, when we are stressed, when we're feeling anxious, when we're feeling depressed. When we start to recognize these patterns, we can begin to develop, with the Holy Spirit and an appropriate spiritual person as well, some plans for dealing with those kinds of situations so that we're less likely to be tripped up by them. So this is the implicit guideline that St. Ignatius is giving by presenting us this metaphor of the enemy acting like the leader of a band of brigands. It's rather like this. This fortified town recognizes that from time to time these bands of brigands come along, and it seems no matter how much we've prepared, they always manage to somehow find a way to get in and capture our city and plunder us. So what if we took a page out of their book? What if we, as leaders of the city, went riding out and made a circuit around our walls. And we began to recognize that there's a particular place where it's in disrepair. It's falling down. And that's where we're always attacked. And what if we acted upon that? What if we strengthened the wall? Repaired the broken bricks and mortar and so on. Raised it up even a little bit higher than it has been previously. What will happen then? Well, eventually that roving band of brigands will come back, but they'll make a circuit of that town, thinking that they'll find the same weak spot, and they find that it's not so weak anymore. The defenses have been strengthened. And now they have a choice. They can either try to attack anyway and risk being overthrown, or they can just simply move on and look for another town that's not so well prepared. What St. Ignatius desires in giving us this rule, as well as all of his other rules, would be that we would be well prepared to recognize the tactics of the enemy, to become aware and to understand, to be able to name them, and thus to be able to reject them with the help of God's sufficient grace, which we never lack. He also wants us to recognize the work of God through spiritual consolation and to be able to receive it so that it bears more fruit in our lives. If we begin to apply these rules for discernment, slowly, often by trial and error, we will learn from them, and we will grow in our confidence, knowing that we really are following what God is asking of us, and that we really are resisting the ways that the enemy is trying to disrupt and thwart that. Thus we can go forward less captive to spiritual desolation and its harmful influences, and the other temptations of the enemy that try to turn us aside from rising from good to better in following God and in our relationship with Him. I hope that you've found this series helpful. Thanks for taking the time to persevere all the way to the end, and God bless you.